cause of most cervical disease. This is infection by the human papillomavirus. And so we have the sensitivity in these infrared spectral methods to detect viral infection. Again, this is without sample preparation. We take the cells and dry them. This is our entire sample preparation. We don't stain them. We're looking at the unstained cells. We're looking at the inherent chemical signature change. And this is why this is such a powerful technique. And that made the cover of a Nature journal. Laboratory Investigations is the pathology journal of the Nature publishing group. And we can do the same thing for in the histopathology. So we moved from detecting tumors which were 8 millimeters across to individual tumor cells. So we can spectrally identify, our algorithm picked out those two cell nuclei as being cancerous cells because they have a different chemical composition and the spectrometer detects them. In this acceleration process, we have also switched over to tissue microarrays. This is a typical tissue microarray which you can buy, and if you look at some section of it, you have a large number, typically 100 or more tissue cores. You can have easily 15 different patients, 20 different patients with different disease stages and so forth. And also in the data computation, and actually Dave Cayley unfortunately has left. He was very much behind in these methods to get the computations accelerated. We started out for a typical image taking about 45,000 seconds. It's about half a day. Then by proper vectorization of the code, we got it down to about 150 seconds. And now with parallelization on the NVIDIA graphics board, we're down to 1.5 seconds. Mind you, that's a factor 30,000 speed up, which is significant. So, at this point, we had published the patent. We had used the university PR department to have a press release on the oral cancer screening, which was one of the cytology efforts which we did, which is now in a preclinical trial. In the meantime, unknown to us, a company called Blue Slate in New Jersey started to get involved or started to get interested in cancer screening and cancer diagnostic altogether. They contacted us in October 2009, and just for a first fact-finding mission, in 2009 the patent for this PapMap approach received PCT approval. Early this year we had these two papers on the cytology in Laboratory Investigations, which is this Nature journal. We filed then two more patents on data acquisition. And in 2010, in August 2010, Blue Slate actually filed for a company name for the commercialization, and hopefully in 2 weeks, keep your fingers crossed, we have the license agreement signed, and by then we will go forward with a number of projects which are in the planning stage, and we'll have then a new diagnostic methods for early and more accurate cancer diagnosis, cancer detection, for cancer staging, for prognosis. The infrared spectrum can quite nicely determine in which direction cancer is going, and hopefully for therapeutic intervention based on the spectral data. And for colleagues of mine who are in a similar juncture right now, I have 3 pieces of advice. Use the university resources, for example, for public relation. They are very good at writing press releases and get them in newspaper. And then, of course, the IP department, Jeff is sitting right there, for patent application and technology transfer. The patent committee was actually very, very interesting and very helpful, decided to pay for the patent. This is, of course, very helpful. If you're in the medical field, don't let sometimes the negative reviewers' comments distract you. And this is something which was just said. If an idea is novel, you may get a lot of critique and criticism. If an idea is old, then of course everybody accepts it. And then finally, arm yourself with endless patience. Everything takes 3 times as long as you anticipated originally.
I'd like to start by introducing Blue Slate. We're a New Jersey company. The founders of the company are medical device background through a couple of generations, a lot of orthopedic work, and very successful in there. And the work that came out of that resulted in a couple of companies being formed and sold, and those companies, then the direction changing, where Blue Slate was created as a medical technology company with the mission to create new medical technology companies and bring them along to maturity. Our vision on doing that is that we recognize this takes time. We understand there are a lot of regulatory challenges and hurdles to overcome, and our timeline is not a short timeline, that we see that this can take anywhere from 5 to 10 years, very likely, and we have the focus and staying power to pursue that timeline. Currently, we have a couple of companies in very nice timing. They're young companies, a couple of years old. We have carved out kind of a niche space in extremity orthopedics, and the company outcome is at a perfect spot at the moment for the investments made and for the goals, and it seems to be going very well. Our business is also international. Our companies sell in 30 countries around the world. So we take the products from concept and early development stage through to commercialization and delivery. So I thought what I would talk to is kind of following on the talk of this morning. How do you get through that valley? And I thought the presentation was fantastic. And 2 things that stood out for me was the movement of the risk curve and the champion curve. And when that woman gave that nice presentation where those curves come in, of course the valley rises up. It doesn't look quite so deep. And it also, if you think about that, it moves you over earlier in the development curve on the scientific side and the technology side. If you were to say, I'm going to enter this space, and you follow her advice, which I think is very good, find a champion and understand and be willing to take some risk, you have to pick up the technology a little earlier on, and I think that's a strategy that we want to follow. To do that, though, you have to do a lot of work, and it requires some patience, because here I show kind of a funny diagram, but it doesn't really mean too much to anyone but myself. But here is a map of cancer, and what you see in the primary gold boxes are our primary cancers, and those break out into subtypes and variations. And so if you want to go into the cancer space, I guess you have to understand what's moving around there, and we did take some time to look at that. The other thing we see in looking at the work that's been presented in many of the presentations today, not just Max's, is that there are some information paradigms that are somewhat limited. Here you see a lung tissue sample, and you see going to across the top here kind of a conventional view of analyzing that. But what you see is that with the current spectral technology and computational technologies, you can jump from that into the digital stain or false color image, and that puts the information in another format, which has a lot of advantages. Then if you follow one look at diagnostic approach, you'll see a panel generated to try and type in the tissue and the state of the disease. What you see is no matter how large that panel is, because of the method being used, that panel will be limited, and it will always leave information untapped in the sample that has diagnostic potential. So there's a box of new information, and that's, I guess, primarily what we saw as something we were interested in. And then you could break that problem down into elemental spectra, as we show here, and then composite spectra, as Max has talked about. And so the process, you start to see a process emerging of how you can maybe handle that information. You may want to, when you're bringing on a new technology, take you have to put it in a context of what people are doing today. People will recognize only really what they've seen before. It's very hard to walk up to something and recognize it and you don't know what it is. And so people operate from that view. If you look at taking lung cancer, for example, there's CT imaging is really, as we see here, as we're saying, is looking at lesions. It's not really looking at cells, so it's not really looking at a diagnostic data. And people have worked around that in different ways, and new technologies have come in to try and address that. One of them is an area also, I think, in Max's lab in the Raman space. And then if you go down below and we start to focus on the diagnostic elements, the tissue and then the cells, you can take the technology and try and map it against the competing technologies. And this is just maybe somewhat crude but effective without making a career out of it, a kind of an effective way to kind of lay the technology in. And then what you see is when you do that, some leverage starts to pop out. And so what we're looking for, obviously, in technologies that we get involved with is if there is a leverage position that we can work with. So continuing to use lung as a model, now we start to say and come into the customer, because if you look at that, if you remember that woman's presentation on the Valley of Death, there's a point where a small company gets involved because none of the big companies, no one wants to make the career limiting move of committing to an R&D budget on something, so they'll leave that to the small company. And then there'll be a point where an investor